Tangkan Tado, Yambi Sensin Tang, Hoa Toma Mevan, Maron Song, Pama, Pama Yambaka, Maran, Pain, Pop, Transen, Tenga, Sensin Tetangi, Tata, Covid Nila, Domarke, Rongin, Neaba, Tetangi, Songi, Hong Toppers, Teyechedo, Baron Town, the Chusam, Niamba, Sam, the Long the Yang Taba.
Imagine space in its utterly inconceivable vastness. Just as utterly inconceivably vast is the number of beings that inhabit the worlds. And all of these beings, invariably at one time or other, have been our kind parents, our fathers and mothers who have shown us love and kindness, whom we in this way owe a debt of gratitude. All of these beings, however, presently are immersed in what is called the ocean of suffering, commonly known as Samsara. And in order to repay their kindness, we could resolve to establish all of them in the awakening, that is the liberation of such suffering, that is the awakening of Buddhahood. That should be our motivation, that should be our driving force, that should be the enlightened attitude, or the chitta as it is commonly known, that we should bring about. With this motivation at heart, with this vast attitude to bring about welfare and benefit and ultimately liberation for all of these beings who have been our kind parents, we should now proceed to listen to the Dharma instructions which Rinpoche is about to deliver.
Gode Yantape, Tende Yantapa, Shini, Kotana, Tige Tana, Soso, Gomju, and Gombaton, Kodinga, Soso Yori.
We will now continue with the next chapter, or the next song, as it is literally called in Karma Chakma's text, the fourth chapter or song. And that starts out with the words, literally in Tibetan, Ema, which means how wonderful, or as someone many years ago suggested, far out. And then he goes on to say, these teachings of the objects of the main practice have to be understood and have to be put into practice. One has to understand them, and one has to know how to put them into practice, how to actually meditate according to the teachings. And this simply means to say that, of course, first we need to understand what this which we set out to do is all about in the first place. Mind nature, mind for that matter, how is that supposed to be, how is that to be understood or looked at. And once we have theoretically understood these, at least to these points, at least to a certain extent, then we actually have to put the various meditation practices into practice. We have to apply these methods. So there are two basically subdivisions. There's the theoretical knowledge, so to speak, that we have to understand at least to a certain extent, and then there's the practical application. And about these we will be taught in the following verses in the teachings of Karma Chakra.
Then some Sherab was on the door. Then some Sherab Tambo two tan, dig dan candy so many. Dig dan the Goa candy Jibu, La Sopatella, some Sherab. Then two tan, some Sherab, then Yanni Yando, then some Tambu. Then some Sherab, teach you then the young Tabaki Hakoni. Then dig down, then gone became meeting time. Then that time in Kasi is on a dig tank, that dig down, gone to somebody.
Accordingly, Karma Chakra continues to say, first, you have to understand the things that are to be understood, or you have to know the things which are to be known. And then you have to meditate as much as you can about these objects or about these points. This basically tells us exactly the same thing as we have heard before. First, we have to familiarize ourselves with the various subjects of knowledge which there are. We have to listen to them, we have to listen to teachings and instructions by our teachers, or we have to read the corresponding, we have to study the corresponding texts. And once we have, in this way, heard or read, or in whichever way internalized the teaching, we have to reflect about the teachings. We have to think about them to make sure, have we truly understood or not? Is more study, is more listening to teachings and instructions in order, or rather not? And once we have made sure that we have actually brought about at least a reasonable understanding of these subjects, well, then we have to put them into practice. Then we have to actually sit down and do it, so to speak. Do what? Do meditation. Train ourselves in meditation practice. As Kamachakma also says, once these subjects have been understood, then you have to meditate as much as you can about these subjects, or upon these objects of meditation, as it is called here in the English translation of the text, which means to say that this is a repetitive process. This is not something we do once and then we're done with it. Once we have understood or think we have understood, we dispense with any further study. That would be the wrong idea. We have to time and again check ourselves, time and again make sure that we have a proper understanding, time and again check ourselves against various points whether or not they are properly really understood, and then again and again reflect about them, which means to say reflect about them and actually sit down and practice. This sitting down and practicing can then be done in all sorts of ways. We can practice all sorts of meditation sessions of various lengths depending on whatever time we have at our disposal. So this is the sequence in which things have to be practiced. First listen to teachings or read teachings as you have them available, reflect about them to make sure you have truly understood what the subject matter is all about, and then sit down and put it into practice and bring about a personal experience and certainty by way of doing so. On it goes in our text, saying, other than the infallible three jewels, which are Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, of course, there is nothing that can in any way protect from the sufferings of the ocean of Samsara. In this regard, we are being constantly reborn. While not awakened beings, we are constantly reborn without any control over it, somewhere within this cycle of suffering. We may be reborn in any of the 6 realms of samsara, and then of course experience all the various unspeakable sufferings of these particular realms. If we were to be reborn in the hell realms, then heat and cold and all its all sorts of other sufferings would be our lot. Whereas with the rebirths, as in the hungry ghost realm, we would predominantly suffer from extreme hunger and thirst and all of these deprivations. In the animal realm, for the most part, beings experience the suffering of being enslaved, of being exploited, etc. And in the human realm, we have the commonly known sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and eventually death. We could also be reborn in the demigod realm, in the asura realm, the major suffering of which is that of exhausting themselves constantly through strife, fighting, warfare, etc. and so forth. And then eventually also there is the highest of the 6 realms of the samsara, which is the God realm, which for the most part is a rather more pleasant experience. But eventually also the good merit has brought about such an experience will be exhausted, and then they suffer the extreme suffering of change, namely of falling down again from their God existence into a lower existence, which of course, needless to say, causes them extreme suffering, extreme horror and pains, etc. So, other than the 3 jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, there is nothing in this world, there is nothing anywhere, wherever, whatsoever that could possibly protect us from these sufferings. Therefore, of course, we would be well advised to turn our mind towards these 3 jewels, as Kamachaka says. If we took the time to consider the various unspeakable sufferings within samsara, we could indeed begin to think who is possibly able to protect from these sufferings, who could possibly even free us from these sufferings. And if we were to think in terms of the ancient, of the old Indian gods, we could think, well, maybe the chief god of the desire, Indra, could do so, or the god Chakra, or maybe the god Rahu, or whatever different gods there might be. However, if we would think about it properly, we would come to realize that even though these are all powerful gods, there are still just beings which themselves are still within this cycle of suffering, within samsara. So therefore, since they themselves are still subject to the laws of samsara, of course they are not able to ultimately protect us from the sufferings, from rebirth and samsara and all the various sufferings that entails. It's just not within their power to do so, even though they are very powerful. They're not as powerful as they have to be in order to protect us from these various things. Therefore, if we thought about it clearly, we would come to realize quickly that only those can protect us efficiently and lastingly from the sufferings of samsara who have gone beyond samsara, who have left the suffering of samsara behind themselves, which are none other but these beings who have achieved awakening, who have achieved total liberation from suffering, which of course are none others but the Buddhas. That which brings us to the cessation of suffering is the teaching that the Buddhas have given us, and the guides upon that path are the sublime Sangha, those who have already traversed the path to Buddhahood, who have also freed themselves from suffering. So only these 3 jewels, or the 3 rare and precious ones, as they're called, the Buddha's teaching called Dharma, and the sublime, the higher community of those who practice the Dharma, the Sangha, only these are able to lastingly and to efficiently protect us from the sufferings of samsara. There is no other power that has the ability to do so.
Sonji ke Sundu ke ta, then from Pecha ke, non de Zolo, the long true. And I don't tell to Hotu Tongi ke, and it's something new brownie, Shannon, the Hong last one, Rumble Seba, that is a dog true. I did choose the long just sort of Jackson Road. I don't know, Torin Butcher and Rona, long Yapuja, things to do. Better young I don't know, Sonji Jacon, top of the Sapala, Tom with you, long to me, the long just sort of Jackson Road, that long terror thing in Drogön. And then Papa get this one, I don't know, Drog Daily singing men, and a long Northern Rover, long Chan Rover. 冇個用到啊！我諗做沙家居民街啦，上呢，兩天也不是面，很過好多啦，然後就馬上，然後就自然的不的，要建筑就是建建筑，要那等第三家咱出现的，这这玩意儿，这这玩过好难了，也按住着吧。 No, canide, no, ne bullshit, tracce mara. Tracce, carosa, a giù sciolto due. Tracce mara, non si fa, si prende, non si io, non do, si prende. Si io, ma non io, non te ne si letto. Ciò che in me, non ti trova younger. Se ciò che in te la trovati. If
we were to look at those who have the ability to truly protect us from the ocean of suffering, the objects of refuge or sources of refuge as they're called, Kamacham continues to explain that according to the Sutra tradition, these are known as the three rare and precious ones whom we know to be the Buddha, his teaching, the Dharma, and the sublime, the higher community of those who have already practiced the Dharma, which are called the Sangha. According to the mantra tradition or the Tantra tradition, they're known as the Lama, the Yidam, the Dakini, or as Guru, Deva, and Dakini. If we were to look at the first of them, the first set, according to the Sutra tradition, the first protection that there is the Buddha himself, the very source, the very wellspring of all of these instructions and teachings which allow us to achieve the state of Buddhahood in the first place. Being our guide, being our ultimate protection, he who has demonstrated the awakening of Buddhahood in this world has shown the path by way of demonstrating how it is to be traveled, how it is to be traversed. In this regard, he has, for the duration of 3 incalculable eons, accumulated merit, has shown how to go about this, has demonstrated how to avoid all the various pitfalls of confusion, etc., and so forth, which for the most part keep us from becoming liberated from samsara, etc., and so forth. So in this way, the Buddha is our first, our ultimate, our highest guide. But the Buddha, having demonstrated how to become a Buddha, how to become liberated of suffering, has at the same time, by way of doing so, also taught the Dharma, has taught the Dharma in many different ways, in such a way so as to show the path, so as to guide us upon that path and show us how to get along on this path. This is the teaching of the Buddha itself. This is what we call the Dharma. All of these many demonstrations that he has given, all these many different teachings that he has given in order to guide us onto the path and to spur us on that path onwards towards the goal of the achievement of liberation. And when we speak about the Dharma as such, we generally subdivide the Dharma into 2 categories. We speak of the transmitted Dharma, or scriptural Dharma for that matter, and we speak of the experienced Dharma. Scriptural or transmitted Dharma, for that matter, would be all of these Dharma teachings which have been written down, the teachings of Buddha himself, the various commentaries by many enlightened masters who followed after the Buddha, all of these teachings which have been brought into the form of books or other such media that we can avail ourselves of in order to familiarize ourselves with the Dharma. when we then actually sit down to practice the Dharma, to put it into practice, to make it into our own personal experience and gain certainty of the validity of the Dharma in this way. This, the sorts of practices like shamatha meditation, vipassana meditation, shina and lakton as they're called in Tibetan, and so many other techniques, this is what we call the experienced Dharma or experiential Dharma. This is our putting Dharma into practice and by way of personal experience gaining certainty about the validity of Dharma. Now, having taken the Buddha as our refuge, we also, or as our protection, in the same way we also take the Dharma in this way as our protection. And as it is with any path that anyone could possibly travel, of course we also need a guide upon that path. And these are those who we know as the Sangha, or the highest, the sublime Sangha, Arya Sangha, which means to say those who have already achieved liberation through the practice of Dharma. When we speak about Sangha in that regard, we do not mean the likes of us, but we mean the sublime, the highest Sangha. These are like guides upon the path, like spiritual friends as they're called, who already have gained experience and who can protect us from the various pitfalls, the various errors that we could possibly make on the path, so that we could, that we in all likelihood would go astray. This is no other than wishing to travel from point A to point B, from one place to the other. If we are ignorant about which road we have to take, in all likelihood we end up somewhere completely else, but not where we want to go. And very often, as we vigorously set out on the road, not really knowing exactly where to go, we often just, so to speak, chase our own tail and end up where we started from. In this way, we are often rather thick, one could say. We don't want to ask someone. We think we can do it by ourselves. We think we have the wherewithal and the knowledge to do it. And then in the end, we just end up again where we started out. How come? Of course, we have not taken the time to listen to someone. Therefore, we should make sure to do this. Do not fool yourself that you know right from the outset, that you understand right from the outset everything by yourself, and you do not require a guide upon the path. This guide is by all means necessary, and they can send us off into the right direction, and every now and then can correct our path, can correct our errors, so that we head straight for the goal, so to speak. In this way also the Sangha, those who have already traversed the path that leads to liberation, who are experienced in its various methods and techniques, etc., are necessary. And in this way, these three, the three rare and precious ones, the Buddha is teaching the Dharma, and the community of those who have practiced it, the Sangha, are our sources of refuge.
Songji je ko tijaba kandi yana de temba songji nara tapsonro yo yin san na chepe ne ate sitene kuko ne la tagu and chula tapso song ta songji je songbe tanga chuyin na ni beg ki yana on yin ta yan ta ja ki ta 다 게리랑 맞주바 대한테 송기의 송기 주인동나 되게 대대 말도 샤라 또지 샤라서 같은 지란 맞죠 제 다음에 출근도 시장 야 그거지네 되는 제백에 제범으로 내라 나오고 그냥 괜히나 잡서 송이 되는 송기제 나자나 된게 괜히가 딱 괜히 저도 저가 옛날 그럼 뭐는 괜히 되는 간디 옛날용 대한도 송기게 나자나 되게 공사서 옛날 상태 되게 괜히 것도 잘하죠 말하면 잘하잖아요 돼요 담보라 돼요 다 된다고 지금 대상지라 송기죄도 괜히 되시죠 안에 되라 그걸 다 쓰거든요 그거에 상관이
If we were to consider the sources of refuge, the three rare and precious ones, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha for that matter, then of course we remind ourselves that they represent that very state which we aspire to. If we think of the Buddha, or if we come across whatever representation of the Buddha, then this representation of the Buddha symbolizes in a form, in any which way that has taken shape, that very state which we aspire to achieve, which we ourselves wish to realize. And since that is the case, also in our everyday lives, we should show respect to these representations. So whenever we come across a representation of the Buddha in whatever shape it might be it a statue, be it a painting, be it a photograph of a painting, be it a simple drawing, we should respect it in such a way, we should show our appreciation in such a way so as not to disrespect these representations. Therefore, it goes without saying, put them in a high place, put them in a clean place, put them somewhere where they cannot be disregarded, where they can be overlooked, where they could possibly be soiled or damaged. Put them somewhere where they're visible and where you can always where you can always show your respect to them. The same, of course, holds true for representations of the Dharma, Dharma teachings, the very information that the Buddha has brought into the world, which enables us to follow him on the path that leads to the awakening of Buddhahood. These Dharma teachings, no matter in which form, no matter in which language they come along, be they in Tibetan or in English or German for that matter, French, Chinese, what language have you, it doesn't matter which language they come in. If they are clearly recognizable for us as Dharma teachings, they are clearly to be respected. They are to be recognized as the very information itself that enables us to travel the path that leads to the awakening of Buddhahood in the first place. And therefore they are to be equally respected. They are not to be left lying around on the floor. They are not to be stepped over. Certainly not to be stepped onto. So therefore, whatever Dharma teachings, practice texts, whatever it is that you might find that contains the information of the Dharma comes across your way, just as the representation of the Buddha himself, put them up on a table, put them in a high place, wrap them up in beautiful clothes, whatever you have at your disposal, so to show your respect to these teachings. Do not be unmindful of Dharma texts that you might find in your way, but do not step over them, respect them properly. And of course the same also holds true for representations of the Sangha. In that regard, it doesn't matter whether whatever you come across represents the sublime, the Arya Sangha, the Sangha of those who have already achieved liberation, or the rather more ordinary Sangha of those who are still practitioners upon the path. Even just a little piece of a robe of a practitioner, a monk, a nun for that matter, whatever they might be, symbolizes the Sangha that aspires to the liberation of Buddhahood, symbolizes those who exemplify, those who show the practice of the teaching of the Dharma in this world. So equally as with the two aforementioned objects, also these are to be respected accordingly, and we will all be very well advised to heed such advice. A little note on the side, as you have all noticed, the weather has changed, as it always does here. It's raining, it's cold, and those of you who have not particularly stout and warm tents, please feel free to sleep here in the shrine room at night. So it's not too much cold or anything. Now, needless to say, those of us who have already achieved the status, the great protective beings, Drogön Rechen, who have full control over the inner heat of tummo, we wish, don't we? Those, of course, do not need to make use of this.
아디 님발라 되는 대리 나랑 보신 게 해온 거 팀만 썸 쪼가래 아니 정가래 다 뜻을 잡아 살아 팬도 저는 정가래 신게서 도체 두승 첨바저도 빼면 생년도 최고진도 통지가 딱 두승 첨바 라고 전에 대리신도 그냥 나랑 자동라 라고 토송와 나는 동물라고 토송와 대리신 얘기 다 나랑 점수적인 대입으로도 어제
Drogön Rechen, as we all know, was one of the main students of the first Karmapa, Drogön Rechen, he who knows the 3 times. It was at the time when Drogön Rechen resided at the place in Tibet, at a mountain known as mountainous region known as Gambokanga, and he lived there. He had assembled students there, and he had that habit. Mornings when he had his breakfast, he would eat his tsamba soup, that he would have his bowl of tsamba, and he had various spoons at his disposal, and he would usually stir his tsamba once and eat it. But on that particular day, he knew, he had the clear foreknowledge, and he said so, today one of my great students, one of my great sons is going to arrive. And while saying that or musing about it, he stirred his tsamba 3 times. Proceeding to continue to eat. And eventually, indeed, Drogön Rechen arrived. Drogön Rechen had heard of the great fame of the Karmapa, who had that wonderful name, he who knows the 3 times, Drogön Rechen. He thought that indeed is a wonderful name, that indeed seems to be a very famous person who has got many great qualities. I should really go see this Lama and check him out, so to speak. And he thought of himself, well, I for one am also not a paperweight, so to speak. I have achieved the full control of the practice of inner heat, so I should go and see this Lama, see what qualities he has. As Drogön Rechen then eventually arrived in the presence of this Sherab, he addressed him and said, I've heard your name, I've heard of your great fame, and I've come to see you. I for one have achieved the realization of the practice of Tummo, and since you are so famous and people speak of your fame and your great qualities, we should have ourselves a miracle competition.
아니 뜻은 제밖에서 나는 로기보리 나는 좀저기 내 두사말이 아무 좀디 두바데 나는 통 나는 두바데 포라콘에 통리진 통화 대연도 나는 남간에 두바데 마세 현보요리 엄마 제가 두바자 통화한 거 나는 뜻은 제게 두바 나는 뭐가 있지 아마도 두바데 라는 통과돼요 통통 영어 투바하마데 걸 통해 이제도 말아 거기다 휴무 좋아 뜻은 제게 좀 그렇게 된 거예요 저 하고 봐 저는 그 투바데랑 투바츠롱 나름 저 배라 투마한테 몸을 요마라 라바 힘든 대리 진짜 통하네 아 근데 투바 형분이 너무 싸네 아 저선 제가 좀 그렇게 된 거 그렇게 아 그거 같아가 투바 형분 진짜 싸
So Drogön Rechen had asked Drogön Rechen for a miracle competition, so to speak, to show off who of the 2 would be the more realized one. But Drogön Rechen said, I'm old now, I don't do miracles anymore. Anyways, it's time for soup. Let's have a bowl of soup first and then see where that gets us. So they had their soup together, and Drogön Rechen was utterly amazed because that was the best soup he had ever had. He had never ever in his life tasted a soup so good. And it was so good that, as it is the custom in Tibet, that he licked his bowl completely clean. In Tibet, for the most part, people do not use spoons very much. So when you get to the bottom of the bowl, and then you use your fingers, you stick them in there, lick them off, and lick the bowl, etc. and so forth until it's really nice and clean. You might then have a second helping and proceed in the same way. And he was so utterly amazed that he saw with this soup, it was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, that he also saw that this Tenga had not quite finished his soup. And he said to him, Lama, you don't seem to be finishing your soup. This soup is so good. If you're not finishing, could I finish off the rest of yours? And Dusum Chenpa said, yeah, go ahead, here you are. And again, he did the thing, licked it and cleaned it with his fingers. And was completely unaware that already they were right in the middle of the miracle competition. This most delicious soup already was the first miracle that Dusum Chenpa demonstrated to Drogön Rechen.
And then Drogön son, yeah, could that Satan, yeah, doesn't do them. I can't remember dog Satan to dog in those days. Marin, Kota, Jeremla, Yoga Party, and Young Judges on the Young Judges, some children, the children, the dog, your money. Change the dozen and a dozen, actually, do the children and punk, young basically. And dozen dog do that children can do it. Or a dog column, there's a Zorum, Sepatu, thing in young. That young judges on the that young judges, very lucky so much. You're good as a dog for what they do, like you found to
So as Dusum Chenpa said, I'm too old for this now, but you know, I have a student who is a very realized practitioner. You should go see him, and he could possibly demonstrate a couple of miracles for you if you're so keen. Drogön Rechen did as he was told. He went down into the valley, into the cave where the student of Dusum Chenpa who first come out of practice. But instead of finding a Lama sitting there meditating, he saw a tiger who was just with much delight licking his lips. And Drogön Rechen thought, oh my student has just been eaten by the tiger. What to do? And back to Dusum Chenpa, and he said, oh, great Lama, I've very bad news. Your student has just been eaten by the tiger. And Dusum Chenpa said, nah, he's just practicing the development process meditation. You had better go back down and check again. Dusum Chenpa probably shook his head and thought, oh, okay. Went back down to the cave, expected probably to see the tiger sitting there having a nap. But no, all of a sudden the tiger was not there anymore, but there was a little pool of water, a little lakey, a little pond, one would say. And he was again utterly surprised. He thought, there's no student to be found. At first there was a tiger, now there's that little pond, so he took a little stone and tossed it into the water. I went back to Dusum Chenpa and said, there's no student of yours. I went back, okay, the tiger's gone, but there's a little pond in that cave now. How weird. And Dusum Chenpa said, you see, before you met him, he was practicing development process meditation. Now he's training himself, of course, in the perfection process, and he is now resting in the water-like samadhi of patience. You had better go back and check again. So Dusum Chenpa got everything together, got up and down to that cave again, and of course, as Dusum Chenpa had said, there all of a sudden sat that somewhat elderly Lama. And the stone that he had previously tossed into the pond just lay there in his lap.
And then, Dusum Chenpa, Roma, Masa orders. I'm Masa orders. And then, I don't Zuntur country, the Lama got it. Tigger, Lumba Chung, Jega, then come up there, and the Jinsi Yore. And then Drogön Rechen, another, some more around the Dharma to the Payen, and then the Count on the Ganga, a young tree, then children of us in Martana, children got over the ways. And then Drogön Rechen gets on it. And children can't on the 2 Juni, 去那么当初的人要讲这里，人马上打的就是什么龙波领大啦啊，扎龙岗的有，我们马上打的龙波的这啦，但是扎龙岗动物的这个，但是吃汤的刚汤的吃那么的有，马鸡巴可能的扎龙的到不要干的的，那个人一嘛龙门大，但是刚干的这种。俺家心也是，出家心要记着的，大出当咯，这里出下当就，但是让人要干嘛的，出嘛可能啊，但是就是先把拉上开的，这两个破的出了，干嘛的少人这真出轻松啊，但是俺们但是让个的就是先把就是。那么现在按照还是都是了，全部都空了，倒把全部都就是全部都，肯定过了家，干嘛把就是全部说完大，他拿这个后面这路继续，肯定就是全部的，肯定搞这个，我们嘛到嘛重新搞干的现在弄的，认真的后面做的。
So in this way, Drogön Rechen was rather proud of his achievement of control over inner heat or the practice of tum. And he found himself with this Lama, student of Dusum Chempa, who was known by the name of Basadadir. And that Lama said, okay, I've been ordered by the master, by Dusum Chempa now, to compete in miracle making with you, in magical apparitions. So what are we going to do? And he looked around. The place where they found themselves was a rather narrow valley, which ended in a gorge going up towards the mountain, which then eventually became a little glacier. And Asadadir said to Drogön Rechen, okay, there's one thing which we could do, since we're talking about our achievement of inner heat here. What do you think? One of us goes up to the glacier, sits there and practices, produces inner heat and melts all the water. And the other one of us sits down here and stops whatever water comes gushing down the mountain for that matter. And Drogön Rechen said, get out of here. Who can melt that glacier up there? It's not possible. If at all, this Lama will maybe produce a small trickle. So I'll take the easy part. And he said to him, okay, I stay down here and I stop whatever water you send down. And he thought himself rather safe and sat down, took on the proper position, and Basadadir went up. He was not to be seen anymore. He disappeared somewhere in that glacier. And sure enough, after a while, a little trickle of water came along, and here comes that water, and Drogön Rechen thinks, it's just as I thought, a little bit of water, child's play. Well, the water became more, and then it became rushing down the mountain, and more, until he was really completely washed away by the water. Down valley, tumbling he goes, and he was rather much distressed about that. Of course, he had not expected that at all, that old Lama producing so much heat, really melting all the water of the glacier. Dusum Chempa, in his vision, saw the distress which Drogön Rechen, of course, experienced, and in a single instant he came down to the place, and he said to Drogön Rechen, don't you worry, and with a single movement of his hand, he stopped the water. That was the moment when Drogön Rechen finally got it. I mean, all of the stuff that has been demonstrated to him before had not really impressed him much, but this is the moment where he thought, indeed, this master, Dusum Chempa, he is incomparable. There is no other master who has such realization, who has such powers as him. He prostrated to Dusum Chempa, he circumambulated him, and he said, please, please do accept me as your student. And as we know from history, that was exactly the case. Drogön Rechen was accepted by Dusum Chempa as his main student. He received from Dusum Chempa all the transmissions, teachings, instructions of the Kaji tradition, and he became the main lineage holding student of Dusum Chempa, who passed the teachings of the Kaji lineage on. As Roshi said yesterday, during this year's summer course, we should not only talk about Dharma, we should also do some Dharma practice. And this is now the time, the end of the session, where Rinpoche says we should by all means practice, train ourselves a little bit in shamatha meditation. And we will do today, which at least the English-speaking crowd could not do yesterday because I couldn't forgot to say so. We imagine for that purpose in front of ourselves the Buddha in all of his golden splendor, and we focus our attention upon his heart center as our focus, as our object of concentration. Let's now dedicate the source and roots of all our merits for the second welfare of the being.